Hi, thank you all for being here. I'm Louise Shaner from the Hutchins Center at Brookings. Is this on? I'm really pleased to be moderating today's three papers, which talk about different aspects of state and local finances. And hopefully we'll have interesting discussions that rely on many of the papers. Our first presenter is Kim Rubin from the Urban Institute, and her paper will be discussed by Ben Watkins from Florida.
And I'm going to try hard to stick within my 15 minutes so I am more polite to the other people after me. Can you hear me? Is this on? Yes. And first I should say that this is joint work with two of my colleagues at the Tax Policy Center, Megan Randall and Aravind Budapalli, who are in the audience, but I won't blame them for anything that's wrong. I'll take it all. Okay, so what are we doing? So we're looking at budget processes in the Great Recession. So one thing that was super interesting, if you're a budget nerd and you're a state budget nerd, if you think about this year versus last year and what states have been going through in passing their budgets. So this year, 49 states, sorry Massachusetts, have passed their budgets on time, more or less, and they're all sort of moving forward. They all also ended up with unexpected revenues. So they had more revenues than they necessarily thought they would last year because, most notably, the federal government managed to pass a tax bill, and TCJA has actually expanded the amount of money they get. And in addition, because people were expecting increased tax revenues this year, or that there would be tax reform, they actually were short money the year before. And so last year, when we were at the same point in time, 10 states hadn't necessarily passed their budgets on time. Connecticut passed their budget in October. And as part of what Connecticut did, it also put into place a number of fiscal institutions or budget rules, basically putting more limits on what future governments could do in terms of spending money and how they have to deal with their budgets. So they strengthened their expenditure limit, which is basically how much you can increase spending from year over year. They also had a volatility cap where they basically said that any money that you're not expecting on the revenue side, you need to put into this other fund and not necessarily spend this year. They limited borrowing, and they also put in this bond lock, which is sort of very interesting, and we should talk about that at the cocktail party because it is new, and I'm hoping it is less of a disaster than I think it would be. But what it also did for me is they also did things that you would need to do if you have less money coming in than you were expecting. They also made cuts to their spending and increased taxes. And so last October, 100 days late, they managed to pass a budget. They managed to pass this year's budget early. And so what we're doing isn't necessarily just picking on Connecticut. What we're doing is we're actually looking at, one, what are these fiscal institutions? So things like tax limits and balanced budget rules, what do they mean for states, especially when they're faced with unexpected deficits or surpluses? So if you're going along and you're a state government and you have less money coming in than you're expecting, and you have balanced budget rules, how do you react? Do you cut spending? Do you increase taxes? Or do you basically play some games and sort of hope it goes away the following year, which some of them could have done this past year, and they didn't. They actually did a lot of responsible things last year, which I was really encouraged at the time, and it'll be interesting to see how much of it gets undone this year. So what do we do? So what we do, and this is following off of work that was first done by Jim Paterba in 1994, and full disclosure, I was the research assistant on this paper, so besides showing you how old I am, it has a, place close to my heart. So using NASBO data, or data that's collected by the National Association of State Budget Officers, where they survey state budget officers twice a year, we look at how differences in what they expected their revenues and expenditures to be versus what their actual revenues and expenditures are, and what kinds of actions they took in terms of cutting spending, raising taxes, or if they have extra money, cutting taxes in years when they have surpluses. And so that's basically what we're doing. So what this picture shows, and there's a lot going on here, but it seems sort of interesting to put it all on one graph. So the blue lines are the average amount of the fiscal shock. So if it's above the line, that means there's an average surplus. If it's below the line, it means there's an average deficit, or they have less money coming in than they were expecting. The yellow lines are just the states that are experiencing shortfalls and what their average amounts are. And then the line is basically the number of states that have deficits rather than surpluses. In general, I'm going to be talking about deficits because largely deficits are actually way more interesting than surpluses. If you have more money than you were expecting, you can cut taxes, you could spend more, you could save it. It doesn't necessarily trigger the same kinds of intense actions that need to be taken if you take balanced budget rules seriously. And so what you can see is if you get to sort of 2009 and 2010, we have about 40 states, more than 40 states had deficits, and those deficits were pretty large. And then if you look on a per capita basis, the states that were running deficits actually had fairly high deficits, but often there were fewer of them, and so there were as many surpluses or not. Now, there were certain states that tended to run deficits year after year. That's a whole other thing. We won't call out Illinois yet. But that's the kind of thing we're looking at. And what we want to do is see in the presence of these deficits that weren't expecting. So when you did your budgeting the year before, compared to how much money you're getting in, what did you do? And so this is the equation. I'm not going to necessarily spend a lot of time, but the key thing to note is we're looking at budget cuts where you're cutting your spending, tax change where you're increasing or lowering taxes within the year, or tax next, which is the amount you're going to increase or lower taxes the following year. And so partly we have a lot of regression results that we have the level effects in there, but what we're mostly focused on are these interactions. So if you actually have an unexpected deficit or an unexpected surplus, how do you act? What do you do? And so the first thing to note is when we first did this using only one variable, a fiscal shock variable, we found really different effects in terms of whether you had surpluses or deficits. So in part, we're doing it separately because we rejected the hypothesis that states acted the same way when they had more money in than less money in. And so this is just sort of a picture of how many states made cuts versus tax cuts or tax raises. And you'll see that especially during recession years, which I can't tell, you might not be able to see that there's some gray there. States were much more likely to make budget cuts in terms of numbers of states. And then there are a number of states made tax increases. The more interesting thing is in periods when surpluses are going, there's also a fair amount of tax cutting going on. And so what are we looking at? So in other work that I did with Megan before, we actually looked at the academic literature on these fiscal institutions. So we looked at things like volatility, balanced budget rules, tax and expenditure limits, supermajority rules. And so what we're doing here is we're pulling out some of the ones that seem to have effects in the past, and we're looking at what these effects look like over the whole period from 1990 to 2015, but then also looking at whether what states are doing has fundamentally changed since the Great Recession. And so to not steal my own results, but yes, things seem different after the Great Recession than they were before. Again, if you're a budget wonk, this isn't surprising to you. There's a lot of discussion about how we're in a new normal where instead of things growing by 5 to 7%, they're growing about 2 to 3%. Part of this is evident in the fact that we're 10 years out of a recession and we're still seeing that many states without having unexpected deficits. So what are we looking at? We're looking at states that have weak balanced budget rules. So 49 states actually say that you have to balance your budget, but a number of states actually just require the governor to propose something that he says balances. And so it doesn't necessarily actually have to balance, and it isn't necessarily that the legislature has to pass it. And so what we do is we differentiate the states that seem to have to take real action in terms of actually passing something that balances or having more strict rules in place from those that do not. Then we look at binding expenditure limits. This is where you have a limited amount that you can increase spending from one year to the next, and binding revenue limits, which means that you can't increase revenues more than a certain amount, or you need a supermajority to pass a new tax rate increase, right? So basically, you could imagine in some states like Colorado, if you actually have taxes go up because your economy is doing well, you actually have to give some of that money back. Whereas in other states, it's basically a rule that says that if you want to increase the sales tax rate, you need a supermajority or voter approval to do that. And so we're including those both in one case. And then the last thing we look at is party control. And so whether you are all democratically controlled, all Republican controlled, or whether you have split party control. And so these are the states with weak balanced budget rules. I'm going to do this fast. These are the states with tax and expenditure limits. The key thing to note is the yellow are revenue limits, the pink are expenditure limits, and the green are those lucky states that have both revenue and expenditure limits in place. And then this is super interesting, or it was to me, in that it shows how unified control has changed over time. And the most notable thing about it is the fact that we have way more states with unified Republican control than we had in the past. And so what do we find? So this basically shows the number of states. Ideally, what we would like to do is interact, whether you have a deficit or surplus, with whether you have these balanced budget rules in place, and with party control. What this should show you is how much I can make or not make data scream, because those teeny tiny lines, those are the groups that are in each of these things that we interact with. So we actually ran these three-way interactions. We didn't find much that was statistically significant. So what we ended up doing is we ended up running two-way results. So I'm going to give you some results on balanced budget rules, then I'm going to give you results on tax and expenditure limits, then I'm going to give you results on same party controls, and then I'll give you some information that is sort of suggestive about what happens when you interact all three of them. And so the first thing to note is we actually found that things were different in the early period than the later period. Okay, I'm going to just go to the pictures. Okay, so poor Ben got a 50-page paper with all sorts of regression results in it. You get a chart. So you should all be really excited about that. So what we found in the earlier period is states actually responded to $100 in unexpected deficits with about $60 in changes. And so for all states, that was about evenly split between tax increases and budget cuts. But states that had strong balanced budget rules actually cut more of their budgets than states with weak rules. And then if we go to the tax and expenditure limit states, states with strict expenditure limits versus states with strict revenue limits, this was interesting to me, but then it made sense after I thought about it. So states with strict expenditure limits who are already limiting how much spending can go up each year might have less slack in being able to cut budgets. So they raise taxes. Where states with revenue limits would require a supermajority or more, it would take more for them to actually raise taxes if they found a deficit. And so they actually didn't raise taxes at all. And then we found, not surprisingly, that Republicans did less of this. So this is in the earlier period. But overall, we sort of closed about $60 of the change. So after 2008, we actually found that about $40 was closed instead of $60, so less action was taken. Some of this could be because some of what may have been done in terms of federal stimulus might be outside of general fund budgets. So some of this might not be that they're, worse off. It might be that there may have been other off general fund budget changes that sort of mitigated some of what happened. But what we saw is that weak balanced budget rules basically are doing virtually nothing. They basically kicked the can down the road when they had unexpected deficits. Our no strict tax and expenditure limits seem to be doing less. That's about 26. We found that there was more action in the strict revenue limit states, and that happened even if they had both. And so in parts, things that aren't colored aren't statistically significant compared to what we saw before. So it isn't that states with a strict expenditure limit didn't make cuts. It's just that they didn't make cuts that were different than states that had no limit in place. So it was still so it's $39 versus 26, but it's not statistically different from each other. And then divided government is much more dramatic if you look at the Republican Unified, where they're cutting way less. And there's something that this is the only place where we actually saw some of those interactions with the budget variables and states. Okay, I'm going to take an extra minute. I started late. So states that had unified Republican governments but had strict tax and expenditure limits actually had to act. They actually had to cut spending or raise taxes more than other ones. Okay, so what does this mean? So we find some evidence that fiscal and political institutions affect both the extent and how states respond to unexpected deficits. The relationship seems to have changed in the recent past. What we're hoping to do is figure out whether that lessening response is actually that they're doing less and sort of part of the reason that they were having such trouble after the last recession is because they actually acted more slowly. Or the other thing that might be happening is they might be changing fundamentally how they budget, right? Another way that you might not close things is if you try and not close things by being more optimistic in your revenue forecasts. So more of these unexpected deficits might have grown over time. And so part of what we're hoping to do is look at what's going on in terms of how they're doing their forecasting and their budgeting and how that's affected by economic variables and what this all means going forward. And I'll stop. Thank you.
So this is the first time I've had an opportunity to do this, and so this should be fun, or it's intended to be fun. So Kim did a great job, and I didn't realize she'd been involved with perturbables because that was a seminal research piece on sort of how budget balances affect state spending. So it was interesting to read through this, but I'm very simple-minded, and I don't really, it's hard for me to completely understand the high-minded academic part of all of this in terms of how these variables interact. So my job is to provide you with sort of a practical aspect of what really happens on the ground versus the speculation that might take place about what drives decision-making. And so I'm going to do that by sharing with you our experience in Florida and how the state legislature responded to deficits and what factors they considered and things that changed as a result of that. Some of which may or may not be consistent with what Kim is suggesting could impact this. What's that?
You have the clicker.
I don't know, let's try this. Yeah, there we go. So this is just a picture of Florida's general revenues, and you can see the free fall from 2006 to 2009, where revenues dropped about $6 billion or 22%. So you got to figure out what to do, right? If you got less money coming in, you're going to have to spend less or figure out some way to balance the budget. And the state confronted budget deficits reaching as high as $5.5 billion in 2009. So that's asking somebody to do it. People who like to spend money, asking them to cut the budget's like asking them to do an unnatural act. So it's not an easy thing. So the question is, what do you do? How do you respond to that? And so our profile for the state of Florida is, we've had Republican control for many years of both the House and Senate and all the executive branch. So we've got that attribute that that is our characteristic. We do have a balanced budget requirement, but it's not a strict balanced budget requirement. It doesn't even really come into play. There's both a revenue limit, and it just basically says appropriations can't exceed expenditure or can't exceed revenues. So but really it's important how it gets implemented. So there's not a real strict scheme about how that's done. We do have a revenue limit, but like I said, it doesn't come into play. It's like last year's revenues plus a growth in personal income, but we're so far above the cap that it doesn't come into play. But here's the really important part is the statutory framework for fiscal management, revenue estimating conferences, and projecting revenues and actually budgeting to your revenues. And there's a policy limit on debt, but that's a soft limit that the legislature can overcome. So this is not surprising to those of you who live and work in this world, and that is the budget balancing exercise. So there's three key elements, I think, of any government confronted with the deficits is, first, you got to cut spending, and then you may have reserves set aside to use, and then the third thing is raising revenue or raising taxes. So during the Great Recession, that's exactly the recipe, I think, that all governments used in balancing. We had spending cuts, so you can see the appropriations decreased. We also spent down our reserves. We also had federal stimulus monies, obviously, and that helped a lot over a period of time to make the transition and allow the economy to start growing again and allow revenues to start growing again. And then this was very much, again, an unnatural act for a Republican-dominated legislature. That is, they raised revenues. So $1 billion in recurring revenues. They don't like to do that, but that was a necessary part of the budget balancing exercise. So additional steps. Now, these are things that you might not think about being associated with budget deficits, but it is pension reform. Was a spin-off of the Great Recession because it's another budget balancing exercise. One is to take a pension holiday, which saves money in contributing, and you don't feel the impact of it in the near term, but you do over the longer term. But the other is making structural changes to the pension to make it, to the defined benefit plan to make it more affordable. And then obviously substitute pay-go financing or substitute financing for pay-go, in this case $450 million for prisons, reduce capital spending, cut staff, and freeze salaries. And then one of the things, and I think there was a discussion about Connecticut and what they did in relation to going down. We did the same, something similar in the sense that a revenue stream collapsed and the legislature took action to avoid a default by pledging all of the revenues from documentary stamp taxes rather than just a portion. Because it's a tax on real estate transactions, it collapsed and we weren't going to have enough money to pay. So they made 100% of those monies available rather than just a portion of those monies available. Anecdotal observations in terms of how this may impact states. One is there's more political acrimony now, or at least last year in Florida, there was more political acrimony. Even though everybody's in the same family, everybody's supposed to be on the same team, the Speaker of the House took the governor's policy initiatives at the outset, took them hostage straight away. And so it was there was a lot of acrimony between the House and Senate and the governor's office, even though they were supposed to all be on the same page. And I think late budgets is a consequence of that sometimes when you have one party in power. After a while they forget about what got them there and the principles that got them there, and they get sidetracked with other things. Late budget, we had more late budgets, not this past year, but the year before, probably in any other time. And I think that's a reflection of the political acrimony. Pension holidays, chronic versus episodic, is something to focus on from a credit perspective. Ballot initiatives and revenue limits can change the landscape. I know we've got a supermajority requirement being proposed as a constitutional amendment that would require 2/3 of the legislature approving any tax or fee increase. From my perspective, it really doesn't matter because they're all Republicans and hate to do that anyway. And so there's an anti-tax sentiment already, regardless of whether you need 2/3 or not. And it's all controlled by one party. We had an awful lot of credit downgrades during the credit crisis. We saw an awful lot of deficit spending and one-shot budgetary gimmicks to deal with deficits. And Connecticut recently had an interesting approach to that by embedding spending and borrowing limits in their general obligation bond issue, which is very, very highly unusual, I'll say, basically to assure investors and analysts that they're going to do the right thing. So what matters? To me, management and demonstrated fiscal prudence. In other words, how is a jurisdiction managed? What can you expect from them? Integrity of institutional processes. I know in Florida we got a 3-year plan that's required, and then we do use a revenue estimating conference process, and then there's required actions that have to take place when revenues are not coming in as projected. And then fiscal discipline, structural budgetary balance, timely budget adoption, and avoiding one-shots or budgetary gimmicks. So when I was looking at that was the end of it anyway. So and I'm sure I'm out of time. So who's the timekeeper here?
1 minute.
Oh, 1 minute. Okay, wow. I said a lot for a guy from the South in 9 minutes. When I was looking at the work that Kim had done, I call it IBNR, interesting but not relevant to what really happens on the ground and the dynamics that take place relative to decision making. I think it does have an impact, but there were so many variables moving around that it was really hard for me to assimilate that in any meaningful way. But there clearly are connections, because in reading the conclusions, there are a number of things that I would agree with. But then when you do those interactive 3 different variables, I get lost. It spins me around too many times, and I can't find my due north on my compass.
That's why I was sad I didn't have the charts earlier.
Yeah, to make any real meaningful conclusions that I have a high degree of confidence in. Because I guess from my perspective, those factors imply a degree of rationality and certainty that simply does not exist in the legislative arena. And it is random, and it's driven by a lot of different factors from a lot of different directions. And so it's difficult for me to get my head around and say, yeah, I agree with all of the conclusions in the paper. But it is interesting, Kim. I will give you that, or at least for bond and budgetary nerds. So with that, and I see people in the audience I know from Emily and Emily Rames and Laura Porter, who are experts at all of this stuff and could teach this class. So with that, I'll conclude, and we'll
Sit up here.
take questions.
Kim, why don't you come up?
Oh, we're doing it.
We're gonna do it here, yeah.
There was no buzzer that went off or anything, though. You need to work on that. You need that very loud and long.
Here, why don't you stare, I'll go in the middle, and then we can,
So this
So-
is weird, where we're doing it 1 paper at a time.
this is what
Oh,
we're,
there's.
so, well, thank you very much. So we're gonna take questions. I'm gonna actually start off,
So I don't have
Questions.
notes here from-
So-
This might be a problem.
Oh, it's fine, don't worry about it. I had 2 questions. One is, how do you think about endogeneity of the policies? So, is it really the policies that are doing it, or are the states that are gonna not raise taxes the one that have policies that don't let you raise taxes, number 1. Number 2, something I just kind of want to put on the table, which is kind of interesting. When you think about it from a state budget perspective, and you think about fiscal prudence, and you think about it very much from states don't want to get into trouble. From a macro perspective, the most terrible thing during the Great Recession was how fiscally prudent states were, how much they cut spending, which was very bad for the economy as a whole, and might actually been quite bad for children in schools during that time. So I just want to sort of put that there about how do you think about that when you think about is it good or bad? You can describe what happened, but how do you think of it as good or bad that they sort of were less responsive?
So thank you, that's good. So endogeneity is something that plagues me in all of my
Economics.
fiscal institution work. I think in some ways, what I didn't show is a lot of these things don't change very much. And so the fact that they are fairly long-lived gives me more hope, but it is an issue. Like, I would never say this is caused. I would say that it is related. And being able to pull out the stuff that may have done it. So in work I did in my thesis, going back to many years ago, if I start with when I was a first-year graduate school student, now I'm 4 or 5, I basically instrumented for tells. Like, what is it that drove those and found the same results if you instrument? And here, because what we're looking at is this interaction, so in some ways it means that you're kind of looking at what's going on with the unexpected noise. So in some ways, you have a level effect in there that would pick up some of the endogeneity, and they are longer-lived things. But the fact that we're also looking at sort of things that were in place and how they're responding to something that's more of a shock seems more like changes rather than levels. But I do worry about it, and it is an issue. This broader question about the fact that states, because of balanced budget rules, are acting exactly the wrong way for what we think they should be doing. If you think about state budgets, revenues fall when they hit a downturn in the economy. Demand for public services goes up. But state balanced budget rules mean that on an annual basis, they have to balance. I'm a big fan of the volatility limits, so things like what California's put into place. That part of what Connecticut put into place I really like. So anything that you can get that can make states save money when they're doing well and they have unexpected revenues coming in so that they can save it for a rainy day fund, I'm a big fan of. And so everything that you can do to sort of postpone that, I think is really good. Something that the federal government did that I thought was really good, and part of the fact that if you look at my slides, it's not the first couple of years, it's later that you see these effects. The federal government was actually pretty good this time in terms of providing money fairly quickly to states in a way that the states that were most hard hit by economic things did better. It was really different than when we had the last recession from 2001 to 2003, where basically every state got some money, but it was like after the recession was over. But I think that's the primary issue with states. And this is also why it's sort of problematic as we push more and more of the social insurance and welfare down to states, because they do have these balanced budget rules. And the one time you would actually like the federal government to be running bigger deficits is when we're in an economic downturn so that we can actually stimulate the economy.
Tracy, do we have a, yes, okay.
Is that really fair?
To ask her, oh, yes, it is.
Hi, so Tracy Gordon, Kim's colleague at the Urban Institute, State and Local Finance Initiative. So it seems like you want to make this comparison between pre-2007 and post-2007, and despite having a lot of interaction terms, you don't have an interaction term of def shock and the rule and 2007, right? So your question seems to be comparing these two charts.
No, we do it. So we do it with separate regressions, but we could also run it as one regression where we interact them the same. And so what we did is we looked at whether they're statistically different, which is the same as equivalently interacting with years.
So you did the t-test after the fact.
Yeah.
Got it. Okay. In terms of things that have changed before and after, though, I was going to say, I know that we've had some conversations about the stimulus, and also I think you mentioned something about sort of revenue estimating practices changing. And my perception would be that's not the case. I think if anything, there was a bit of an incentive to say, oh my God, this big economic asteroid is hitting us. And some of the initial projections that I saw for California, for example, from the fall of 2008 were quite dire. So I don't think that they tried to cushion the blow at all. If anything, I think it was politically advantageous to try to recognize the recession for what it was quickly. But you did see a lot of gimmicks. I was just talking to Natalie about the state of Arizona, for example, selling its capital and leasing it back. I think that there was a lot of incentive to do the stuff that was easy first rather than taking actual action. And then I think, as we talked about a little bit in the hallway, but this asymmetry between spending cuts and tax increases, it's a lot easier to cut spending than it is to raise taxes, if only just getting the consensus in the legislature. So you might expect sort of different lags between those two types of operations.
And that's right. And in the paper, what we look at is spending cuts this year and tax changes next year. We also have numbers that look at tax changes this year, but it's because it's much harder to make mid-year tax increases that we actually focus on. That 60 cents is including the following year rather than this year. I think that points are right, and in part, figuring out how many things you put in one regression, the results should be the same. And it's just that it seemed easier to present this way.
Carol?
Thank you. Carol O'Claricon. I was intrigued by your comments from Florida about the reserves, and in other studies I've done, I've looked at what's been changing in the way states use their reserves, but in big part, reserve requirements and limitations on use and necessary refilling of reserves is almost as important, it seems to me now, as balanced budget rules. So I was curious as to what you did with that and whether you see, given the stuff from Florida, I know it from Virginia is very important, and a couple of other places that have no reserves like Illinois and New York, which has weird reserves. It's very, very different. So how did you deal with that?
So we didn't actually include laws about, does it keep going off? So we're looking to look at the mandates for putting money into reserves. Those are newer institutions for the most part. So a lot of this was sort of historical. So in this paper, we didn't actually. Yes, but in part, we looked at longer lasting, but like looking at that is something else we're interested in doing. We started with these two, partly because the balanced budget rules and the weak versus strong just seem sort of the first step to do. And then the tax limits and the revenue limits, we started off keeping the revenue limits separate from supermajority rules for passing new tax increases in budgets. And we basically found that it made more sense to include them, that those states were doing sort of the same thing with discipline. So we would love to go on and do the other fiscal institutions in part. You know, I wasn't as bad as Dan in terms of handing the paper in yesterday, but I did miss the June 1st deadline by about a month. So unlike the states this year, I was much less good at meeting my deadline.
Yeah, so Florida requires 5% of general revenues in reserve constitutionally, and then you have to replenish it. And so that's a key strength from a credit characteristic standpoint. And really, even more important than the credit characteristic is the ability to be able to withstand the inevitable downturns that come and not have to do draconian budget cuts that would otherwise be necessary.
To zero,
Yes.
like New Jersey does? Okay.
Oh, you could, but you have to replenish over the next 5 years.
But not immediately.
Once you spend it, you have to start replenishing, so.
Mark Funkhauser, publisher, Governing Magazine. So one of the things that surprised me when Dan White of Moody's Analytics had this paper, that the big surprise to me was that the increase in expenditures was a bigger hit on states than the drop in revenues. And we always focus on the revenues. Does that seem right to you? And was there a big increase in Florida in expenditures as a result of recession?
The increases would be in unemployment comp, for example, to cover unemployment compensation benefits, and we got advances from the Fed to cover that, like up to $3.5 billion. Medicaid, also the social service kinds of things is really what increased.
And so partly, though, some of what happened, and this is what we're not picking up in the data I'm looking at, but some of this spending was picked up by the feds, right? If you think about the fact that the way that the money came from the federal government in, they gave states money for Medicaid spending and education spending. And so that may have, so it could have looked like overall spending was higher, but their general fund spending was probably lower because there was this additional federal money that went into it. I also think that in general with states, the revenues dropped later than the need for new spending comes in, just because there's just a lag, right? If you
Spending comes first, and then the revenue comes.
typically revenue lags happen, and especially for a state like Florida, where they saw, they don't have an income tax, so part of it's going to be in sales tax, but the bigger hit was probably in their property taxes for local governments. So I think part of it is just the timing of what's going on, and then the fact that some of what looked like increasing in spending had to do with the fact that there was federal money coming in. And especially if you think about federal money coming in for education, that looks like increased state spending, even though it eventually went to the school districts just because of the way that intergovernmental money works, I think.
So I just wanted to quickly go back to one of the things that was alluded to before, which is why it's a good thing we don't have economists in charge of running budgets, and that is this notion that the government's responsibility is to keep the economy running stable and not cut spending when the economy goes down. Government provides for essential services we can't do for ourselves, not manage economies, unlike QE1, QE2, QE3, and QE forever.
Thank you. Mike Belsky from University of Chicago. I have really a couple questions or points about the study. One is, in some states, I think it's just a handful, the executive, when there's a drop in revenue or an increase in expenditures, they have to make a specified cut or increase. So they kind of automatically have that power. And I'm wondering if you kind of picked that up from some of the states you were looking at.
I think that's included in the mid-year budget cuts, right? So what I'm picking up is we're using survey data that the National Association of State Budget Officers collect, and they list what mid-year changes they make. And so in part, I think they include that for those states. But if they decide that that's just part of their business as usual, it wouldn't be in there. But and we add that back for those actions. So I think it's in there, but it would depend on the discretion. Okay. Amusing story. So when I did this for the first time, when I was the RA entering all the data in, Massachusetts was really odd. Dukakis was running for president. Besides the fact to make the Xeroxes, I had to pay a quarter versus 10 cents, which is what it used to cost to go to the State House to do this. But Massachusetts changed how they entered the data into the books. It basically went up by a third. And so I basically had to throw them out. And afterward, it became really clear after the election and Dukakis had lost that they were running much bigger deficits than they were saying they were running. And it was just sort of this interesting thing that there is some of this. Okay.
And then the second part is to Ben. Can you explain a little bit about how you were saying as a best practice you use the revenue forecast, and what happens when that's off? How's that arrived at, and then what happens when that's off? Does that trigger something automatically?
Yes, so you have to monitor revenues coming in relative to the estimates, and you build your budget off your estimates. And if there's more than a 1.5% difference, then it precipitates a mandatory exercise in rebalancing.
Okay, unfortunately, we don't have time for more questions. I know, there's a lot of interest in this paper. Hopefully, you can all chat in the hallways after. I want to please help me thank our panelists.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe for more videos from Brookings.